Alrighty, welcome back to episode 5 of my series of videos highlighting possible NHD topics for your project this year. I'm your host, Mr. Richards. Let's get started. As a reminder, as always, our theme this year is conflict and compromise, so we got to choose a topic related to that. Also, just a reminder, don't forget that our eras of history are the 6 ones leading from early Native Americans all the way through the Civil War. We have already done the first 4. Now we are on to episode 5, which is nationalism, expansion, and reform. This one I have more topics. I have 8 this time. Before I had previous, less topics than that. But there's so much to cover in this era. You've got Andrew Jackson's presidency. You've got the expansion west. You've got changes in the north with immigration. You've got changes in the south with harder stance on slavery. So things are really changing in America during this time. Lots of different topics. But for this one video, I have chosen 8 that I think are pretty neat that you could dive into. First one is the Erie Canal. The Erie Canal is an economic project in New York that's really going to change things for New York and the country. And it was first really supported by this guy named DeWitt Clinton, and he is going to go up against some opposition in New York's government for getting this thing built and getting it paid for. And so I think a cool project would be looking at the conflict between Clinton and his opposition and seeing how they ended up compromising and then agreeing to get it paid for, which in the long run was such a good decision for New York because they end up shipping so much goods that, New York City becomes a powerhouse economically. Other towns spring up here like, Syracuse and Buffalo and Rochester. They all, become more influential in New York now because of the Erie Canal. So long-term effects are huge, but, for the conflict part, you can look at DeWitt and his, the agreement that was made to get this thing started. Topic number 2, the Lowell Mill Girls. This is when women are first really working in the mainstream workplace. They are becoming textile mill girls, working in textile mill factories, making cloth and things like that. And so I think a cool topic would be specifically their strike of the 1830s and 34 and 36 when they're going to go on strike. And this is the first time, striking is still not that big at this time, protesting. Unions are not that big at this time, and here we have women doing it right at the beginning of, setting the trend. So I think a cool topic would be looking at the conflict between women or workers in general and the employment and the employers, the factory owners, and then looking at the compromise. Was there a compromise? How did the strike end? Did it end peacefully? Did the Lowell girls strike? Was it successful? Did they get their demands? Or was the factory owner, did he pressure them to quit, to cave in? And then for long-term effects, look at, women and striking and workplace and, workplace rights in general. How did this set off a trend of, workers' rights? I think that's a great topic for conflict. All right, number 3, we have, the great corrupt bargain. This is a great one. What you have here is in 1824, you have 4 candidates for president, and no one gets, the majority of the Electoral College. You have to have under the Constitution, you have to have a majority. And you've seen this happen before where, candidates will lose the popular vote, like Al Gore lost the popular vote and Hillary Clinton lost the popular vote, but their opposition wins the majority in the Electoral College. Well, this happens in 1824 where I think Andrew Jackson got the popular vote, I think, but all in all, what the moral of the story is no one got the Electoral College. So it comes down to the House of Representatives vote. The House of Representatives they're gonna pick the president. At the time, you have Henry Clay, who is leader of the House of Representatives, and John Quincy Adams is one of the leading candidates for becoming president. And so Henry Clay is going to help swing the votes for John Quincy Adams to become president, and they call this the corrupt bargain because right after Quincy Adams becomes president, he makes Henry Clay Secretary of State. And this is huge back then because typically, if you became Secretary of State, that was a stepping stone for you later becoming a successful presidential candidate. So, all this happens behind closed doors, and they call it the corrupt bargain. They call it, quid pro quo. Pretty much, you do this for me, I'll do this for you. And so you could really look at the compromise between the two gentlemen, the long-term effects, the bargain behind doors, and then the conflict that later happens between Quincy Adams and Jackson. Because Andrew Jackson feels like he gets slighted here, like he gets the raw end of the deal. and he comes back later with a vengeance and wins later. But you could really look at the conflict that's ensuing between those two sides as well. So, great topic. I like it. Speaking of Andrew Jackson, I think the nullification crisis is a great topic because what happens here is you have this unfair embargo, a tariff that's happening at the time, Tariff 1828 and 1832. The South Carolina is actually going to call the 32 one the Tariff of Abominations. They hate it so much, and they think it's unfair for them that they have to pay this tariff because they think it benefits northern businesses, and it's unfair to southern farmers and southern cotton. So they don't like it, and they think that they have the right to just say, no, we're going to nullify, we're going to ignore the law. And Jackson is going to say, no, you don't have the right to ignore the law, and he's going to threaten to bring in the troops. And so what happens is you get this early conflict over states' rights. Do the states have the right to nullify laws? Do they have the right to ignore federal laws if they feel like they are unfair or, in this case, unconstitutional? And so I think this is a great topic for looking at conflict. Pre-Civil War, these are issues that stick around through all the way up to the Civil War. So looking at the conflict between states' rights and the South and the federal government, and then looking at the compromise. In the end, they ended up not having any kind of violence. We get the Civil War down the road, but this particular incident does not end in violence. And so I think it would be kind of cool to look at the compromise. How did Jackson and what he did kind of stave off violence, stave off conflict a little bit longer, keep the Union intact, make South Carolina happy, make everybody happy, and so we could live on another day as a complete Union. That's a great topic for both conflict and compromise. One more Jackson topic, we have the Indian Removal Act. So it gets passed because Jackson really wants to start pushing out the Native Americans from Georgia and the southern regions. And so this is his opportunity to move them out of the territory. And I think this is a fascinating topic because the Supreme Court, the Cherokee are going to sue, and the Supreme Court's going to side with the Cherokee, but then Andrew Jackson's going to say, forget you all, I'm going to just force them to move anyway. So I think this is a great topic for looking at conflict between United States, and Native American populations, Andrew Jackson versus the Supreme Court. How did everybody how did the Army agree to listen to Jackson when the Supreme Court said no? There's a couple of different avenues for both conflict and a little bit of compromise in there, but mostly it's conflict. I think it's a fascinating conflict that you could look into. All right, next, Seneca Falls. This is a great one. You have the Seneca Falls Convention. This is the first major women's rights convention held in the 1840s in Seneca Falls, New York. And I think this is a great one because at the convention, people start disagreeing on what should they support. Should they support, the right to vote, or should they be supporting for more rights, other rights besides voting? And so I think there's a lot of different things here. And Frederick Douglass gets involved as well. And so you could really dive into the conflict in between the women at this convention, looking at what they wanted versus what they thought they could get, and how they go about doing it, their actions, and then looking at the long-term effects. How does this kick off the era of women's rights, leading all the way up, through the next 80 years, all the way up till they get the vote in with the 19th Amendment. So this really kicks off things heavily, and so I think this is a great one for a little bit of conflict between the sides in here at the convention, but really what they agree upon and the implications of this convention afterwards. Harriet Tubman. Harriet Tubman's great. I thought of this one early on because I think it's kind of wild to think about Harriet Tubman escaping slavery and then coming back into the South and to help people escape slavery on the Underground Railroad. So I think Harriet Tubman would be a great topic because you could focus on her compromising her safety to come back into danger to help people out. But then even further, I think it'd be neat to look at the the Underground Railroad. People had to have compromise to stay in people's houses and be hidden along the way. So you could really dive into the specifics of the Underground Railroad. Did they have to pay off people? Did they have to compromise with anybody? Was there conflict? How much conflict did they have to face on the Underground Railroad between slave catchers and people turning them over and spies and other things that they might run into. So I think this is a great one to look at the conflict, between the escaped slaves and the slave catchers, but then the compromise where on the Underground Railroad to get these people to safety. So there's a lot of different topics with Harriet Tubman I think that could be kind of different and kind of cool. Lastly, for this era, I got John Brown. John Brown's also going to be, thinking about slavery, and I think that John Brown is neat because it's kind of like when we looked at Washington with the Rescue Rebellion. This is kind of like a guy who's reached his point where he is not going to compromise, and so I think he's going to be involved in this raid where he's going to try to get slaves to escape and arm up and then pretty much take down the South and the slave system. And it's not going to happen for him. It's going to be totally thwarted. But I think this topic would be cool to look at. How does John Brown get to this point where he feels like there's no compromise left? Like how, things are breaking down that not even Congress, nothing in society, no one can agree anymore, and that he feels like conflict is the only way, violence is the only way to get slaves free. So I think it's an interesting topic about how a man reaches a point where he is so uncompromising that he feels like he needs to be violent to help the slaves out. I think it's a great topic. So, there's a lot more topics available. Of course, I barely even touched on westward expansion, and there's some things with that I think that are really cool. You could look at the Mexican-American War and things like that. So I think that the Mexican War, and look at some other ones too. So check back next time when we look at the Civil War, and I will see you next time for episode 6. Adios.